Captain Marcus Whelan ordered his column to make camp in a shallow creek bottom, while the other officers stared at him like he had announced his intention to surrender to the Comanche. Every man in the regiment knew that high ground meant safety, that ridgelines offered visibility, that elevation gave defenders the advantage that had won battles since ancient times. Whelan ignored their protests and positioned his 53 men in a depression that hid their fires from anyone more than half a mile distant. The other captains predicted disaster. They said raiders would swoop down on the blind troopers and slaughter them in their bedrolls. Instead, 6 weeks passed without a single night attack on Whelan's company, while the units camping on prominent terrain lost horses, supplies, and men with numbing regularity. A 60% reduction in night raids, achieved by doing what every cavalry manual said never to do. Chapter 1. The High Ground Obsession. The United States cavalry of the 1870s inherited its tactical doctrines from a European tradition stretching back through centuries of continental warfare. Officers who had studied at West Point learned principles developed on the battlefields of Waterloo and Austerlitz, where massed infantry formations clashed across open terrain and the army that held the high ground usually held the advantage. These lessons had proven their worth in the Civil War, where hilltop positions at Gettysburg and Fredericksburg demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of defenders firing down upon advancing enemies. When these same officers transferred to frontier duty, they brought their doctrines with them. The Army's field manuals explicitly recommended establishing camps on elevated positions whenever terrain permitted. High ground offered clear sight lines in every direction. It forced any attacking force to advance uphill against prepared defenders. It provided natural drainage that kept camps dry during rain. And it satisfied an instinct buried deep in human psychology, the ancient understanding that predators attacked from above and prey sought the heights for safety. What the manuals failed to address was the fundamental difference between European warfare and plains combat. On the frontier, the enemy did not march in formation across open fields where their approach could be observed for miles. The Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne who contested cavalry operations across Texas and the Indian Territory fought with tactics refined over generations of mounted warfare. They struck at night, in small groups, with objectives focused on horses and supplies rather than pitched battle. They valued stealth above all else, appearing from darkness and vanishing before effective resistance could organize. Against such enemies, the advantages of high ground became liabilities that few officers recognized. A camp positioned on a ridge or hilltop announced its presence to anyone within visual range. During daylight, dust and movement revealed location. At night, the glow of campfires silhouetted against dark sky could be spotted from extraordinary distances. A company camped on prominent terrain might as well have posted signs inviting attack. The raiding parties that plagued cavalry operations understood this mathematics with perfect clarity. A war party approaching hostile territory did not need scouts to locate enemy camps. They simply scanned the horizon for the telltale smudge of smoke by day or the orange flicker against the sky by night. Once located, the approach route could be planned at leisure. The raiders knew exactly where to find their targets, while the soldiers remained blind to threats that materialized from darkness beyond their firelight. Captain Marcus Whelan arrived at Fort Sill in the spring of 1874 with a record that suggested conventional competence without particular distinction. He had served creditably in the last year of the Civil War, survived Reconstruction duty in Louisiana, and received his frontier posting with neither enthusiasm nor complaint. Nothing in his previous service indicated the tactical heresy he would introduce to plains warfare. What separated Whelan from his fellow officers was not brilliance, but attention to patterns that others dismissed as random misfortune. During his first months at Fort Sill, he compiled informal statistics on night raids against cavalry units operating in the surrounding territory. He noted which companies suffered attacks, which escaped them, and what factors might explain the difference. The data told a story that contradicted everything he had been taught. Companies that followed doctrine and camped on high ground experienced raids at nearly 3 times the rate of those that made camp in low terrain. The correlation held across seasons, across different commanders, across varying distances from the fort. High ground attracted attacks. Low ground seemed to repel them. The explanation, once Whelan allowed himself to consider it, was obvious enough that he wondered why no one had noticed before. Chapter 2. The Captain Who Watched. Whelan spent the summer of 1874 testing his theory through observation rather than action. He requested permission to accompany patrols commanded by other officers, positioning himself as a student of frontier tactics eager to learn from more experienced men. His actual purpose was to verify the pattern he believed he had identified, to watch how different camping decisions produce different outcomes. Captain Robert Ellsworth provided the most instructive example. Ellsworth commanded C Company with a rigid adherence to doctrine that characterized officers who valued procedure over adaptation. Each evening, he selected the most prominent terrain feature within reasonable distance of the day's line of march and established his camp with geometric precision. Tents aligned in regulation rows. Fires positioned according to manual specifications. Sentries posted at intervals calculated for theoretical fields of observation. Whelan accompanied Ellsworth's patrol for 12 days through territory known to harbor Comanche raiding parties. On the third night, raiders struck the horse line and escaped with 6 mounts before the guards could respond effectively. On the seventh night, a coordinated attack from 3 directions killed 1 trooper and wounded 2 others before the raiders withdrew. On the 11th night, only a chance encounter between a sentry and an approaching warrior prevented what might have been a devastating assault. 3 attacks in 12 days, a rate that Ellsworth accepted as the normal cost of frontier operations. Whelan noticed something else during those 12 days that reinforced his developing theory. Each morning after an attack, Ellsworth would order increased vigilance for the following night, doubling sentries and extending patrol perimeters. Yet the additional precautions made no difference. The raiders did not succeed because of insufficient guards. They succeeded because they knew exactly where to find their targets. The fires burning on that prominent hilltop served as beacons visible for miles in every direction. The following month, Whelan joined a patrol under Lieutenant Thomas Henley, a young officer whose inexperience had produced an accidental innovation. Henley lacked confidence in his terrain reading abilities and consistently selected camping sites that his sergeants privately criticized as poor choices. Rather than seeking ridges and hilltops, Henley gravitated toward creek bottoms, shallow valleys, and depressions where his men could access water without hauling it uphill. The patrol covered similar territory to Ellsworth's route, operating in the same region during a period when raiding activity had actually increased according to reports from other units. Yet Henley's company completed 16 days without a single night attack. Whelan watched carefully each evening as the camp settled into terrain that concealed their fires from distant observation. He noted how sound carried differently in low ground, how approaching hoofbeats echoed off hillsides and announced themselves long before riders came within striking distance. On the 14th night, Whelan witnessed the dynamics he had theorized. A raiding party passed within a quarter mile of the camp, their horses' hooves clearly audible to the alert sentries. The raiders were searching for targets, their path following a ridge where they could scan the darkened landscape for campfire glow. They found nothing because there was nothing to find from their vantage point. The fires burning in the creek bottom below remained invisible, their light absorbed by the terrain rather than broadcast across the horizon. Henley never knew how close his men had come to attack that night. He accepted the peaceful patrol as luck or providence without recognizing that his poor terrain selection had provided better protection than any number of sentries. Whelan said nothing at the time, filing the observation alongside the growing body of evidence supporting his theory. By autumn, Whelan had compiled enough data to present his findings to Major William Carver, the fort's commanding officer. He laid out the statistics carefully, showing the correlation between camping elevation and raid frequency. He explained the visual dynamics that made high camps easy targets and low camps difficult to locate. He requested permission to test his theory with his own company over an extended patrol. Carver listened with the patient skepticism of a man who had heard many theories from many officers over many years. He neither endorsed nor rejected Whelan's analysis, granting permission for an experimental patrol while making clear that any disaster would remain entirely Whelan's responsibility. The other captains at Fort Sill learned of the plan and offered predictions that ranged from gentle mockery to genuine concern for the men who would serve under such unorthodox command. Chapter 3. The Invisible Company. Whelan's experimental patrol departed Fort Sill in late October 1874 with 53 men and orders to conduct reconnaissance through territory that had produced the highest raid frequency in the previous 6 months. He briefed his sergeants on his camping philosophy before departure, explaining the reasoning behind what would appear to be poor tactical decisions. Most expressed doubts, but acknowledged that the captain's logic held at least theoretical coherence. The first night set the pattern that would continue throughout the patrol. Rather than claiming a prominent hilltop visible for miles, Whelan led his column into a brushy draw where a seasonal creek had carved a depression into the prairie. The men pitched their tents below the level of the surrounding terrain, their fires burning in a natural bowl that contained the light like a lantern shade. Sentries positioned on the rim of the depression could see outward while remaining invisible themselves. Sergeant Patrick Dolan, a 15-year veteran who had survived more frontier engagements than most officers, approached Whelan after the camp was established. He admitted that the position felt wrong to every instinct he had developed over years of Indian fighting. Yet he also acknowledged that he could not recall the last time he had camped in such terrain, and that absence of experience was not the same as evidence of failure. The patrol's first week passed without incident. They covered ground that other units had reported as extremely hostile, crossing trails that showed recent passage of unshod horses and discovering cold campfires that indicated raiding parties operating in the immediate area. Yet no attack came. No horses vanished from the picket line. No shots disturbed the darkness. The men began to notice the pattern by the fourth night. Corporal James Hardin remarked that he had never experienced such peaceful nights in hostile territory. Private William Sutter, who had lost a brother to a Comanche raid the previous spring, slept through the night for the first time since his transfer to Fort Sill. The tension that normally kept frontier soldiers alert, even in sleep, began to ease as each morning revealed an undisturbed camp. On the 9th night, Whelan's theory received its most dramatic confirmation. The company had made camp in a shallow valley between two ridges, their presence invisible to anyone not standing within 500 yards. Shortly after midnight, the sentries reported movement on the eastern ridge. Through the darkness, they could make out a party of perhaps 15 riders moving slowly along the high ground, pausing periodically to scan the landscape below. The raiders were hunting. Their pattern of movement showed they were searching for targets, following the ridge where they could survey maximum terrain with minimum effort. They passed directly above the cavalry camp without any indication they had detected its presence. The fires that burned in the valley bottom cast no glow visible from the ridge. The sounds of horses and men remained trapped by the terrain. The raiders continued their search until they disappeared over the northern horizon, never knowing that their intended prey lay sleeping barely a quarter-mile below. Whelan documented the encounter in his patrol journal with careful detail. Here was proof that visibility worked in both directions. The high ground that tradition promised would reveal approaching enemies also revealed the presence of camps to those same enemies. Concealment trumped observation when fighting opponents who chose the time and place of engagement. The following morning, Whelan gathered his sergeants and shared what the sentries had witnessed. Sergeant Dolan, who had expressed the strongest doubts at the patrol's outset, admitted that he had been wrong. He had spent 15 years believing that seeing the enemy mattered more than hiding from him. Now he understood that against an enemy who controlled when and where to strike, invisibility provided protection that no amount of vigilance could match. The patrol continued for 6 weeks, covering 300 miles of territory that had cost other companies dearly in horses, supplies, and blood. Whelan's unit experienced exactly 2 hostile encounters during the entire period. Both occur during daylight movement rather than night raids, and both resulted in successful defensive actions that inflicted casualties on the attackers while suffering none themselves. The night attack rate that plagued other companies had dropped to 0. Chapter 4. The Doctrine Nobody Wanted. Whelan returned to Fort Sill in December with statistics that should have revolutionized cavalry camping doctrine. His company had operated in the most dangerous territory in the region during a period of intensified raiding activity and had suffered not a single night attack. Compared to the 60% reduction he had hypothesized, the actual results showed complete elimination of night raids for units employing his low-ground camping method. The reception to his findings proved considerably less enthusiastic than the results warranted. Major Carver accepted the patrol report with acknowledgement that Whelan's company had experienced unusual good fortune. He stopped short of attributing that fortune to tactical innovation, suggesting that reduced raiding activity or pure chance might explain the statistics equally well. The other captains at Fort Sill responded with reactions ranging from polite dismissal to open hostility. Captain Ellsworth, whose company had suffered 3 more night attacks during Whelan's absence, rejected the low-ground theory as dangerous nonsense that would get men killed. He argued that concealment meant blindness, that soldiers who could not see approaching enemies could not defend against them. The fact that Whelan's men had detected approaching raiders through sound rather than sight failed to shake his conviction that eyes mattered more than ears. More troubling to many officers was the implication that West Point doctrine might be wrong. Admitting that low ground provided better protection than high ground meant admitting that the principles taught at the academy had failed to account for frontier conditions. Such admissions threatened careers and reputations built on adherence to established wisdom. Easier to attribute Whelan's success to luck than to acknowledge that the manuals needed revision. Whelan attempted one final appeal, requesting permission to present his findings at the next officers' council. He brought his patrol journal, his statistics, his carefully documented observations. He explained the physics of light and terrain that made low camps invisible while high camps advertised their locations. He described the raiding party that had passed directly above his sleeping men without detecting them. The assembled officers listened politely, asked few questions, and returned to their established practices without modification. Captain Ellsworth spoke privately with Major Carver after the council adjourned. He expressed concern that Whelan's ideas might spread to impressionable junior officers who lacked the experience to recognize dangerous innovation. He suggested that encouraging such unorthodox thinking could undermine discipline and lead to preventable casualties. Carver agreed to discourage further discussion of low-ground camping in official settings, though he stopped short of directly ordering Whelan to abandon his methods. The knowledge spread anyway, carried by sergeants who cared more about survival than doctrine. Enlisted men who served under Whelan transferred to other companies and shared what they had learned. The technique that officers refused to endorse officially became informal wisdom that practical soldiers adopted when their commanders were not paying attention. A sergeant might suggest a camping site in low terrain and phrase his recommendation carefully enough that the officer believed the choice was his own. Word traveled through the enlisted ranks faster than any official dispatch could have carried it. Men wrote letters home describing the captain who camped in creek bottoms and never lost a man to night raiders. Soldiers transferring between posts carried the story with them, and it grew in the telling. Some versions exaggerated the number of attacks prevented. Others embellished the hostility Whelan faced from his fellow officers. But the core lesson remained constant across every retelling. Within 2 years, the pattern of night raids against cavalry units in the Fort Sill region had shifted noticeably. Companies that adopted low-ground camping experienced dramatic reductions in attacks, while those that maintained doctrinal positions continued suffering regular losses. The correlation that Whelan had identified proved consistent across different commanders, different seasons, and different levels of raiding activity. Soldiers who survived long enough to become veterans learned to trust terrain over tradition. The Army never officially acknowledged Whelan's contribution, No revision to field manuals incorporated his findings. No commendation recognized his tactical innovation. He completed his frontier service and eventually retired with a record that mentioned nothing of the doctrine he had challenged or the lives his heresy had saved. But the soldiers who served during those years remembered. They remembered the captain who told them to camp low when every officer insisted on camping high. They remembered the nights that passed peacefully while other companies buried their dead. And they remembered the fundamental lesson that Whelan had demonstrated through patient observation and careful testing. Sometimes the best defense is not being found. Sometimes the instinct that tells you to seek high ground will lead you exactly where your enemies expect. And sometimes the captain everyone calls foolish turns out to be the only one who understood what actually kept men alive. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale.